All right. So last class we covered a lot of ground. We started with classes, we did arrays, we tied our code to interface builder, and then we talked about object-oriented principles in general. We'll do a quick review before we jump into the next subject for today. The goal is to learn one more new concept, which is structs. We'll do an app together, a code along, which should be fairly small, should take no more than 45 minutes. And then we'll spend the rest of the time working on the class assignment, just to start putting everything we've learned the past couple of days in practice, just because it's been kind of information overload. So the way to really start getting good at breaking down abstractions and classes and start tying them together is doing stuff, is building shit, essentially. So before we get started, again, structs won't be a huge learning curve. Actually, they're simpler than classes. The comparison is really what we'll need to learn. But we'll do it. Let's do a quick review before we get into classes. So can someone remind me what encapsulation is?
Is it when you take certain aspects of the class for your subclass?
So that's inheritance, right? Encapsulation we really only talked about in theory. We didn't do too much work in it because it's kind of beyond the scope of this week. We'll start working with more encapsulation over the next few weeks. Encapsulation is essentially the theory of only allowing access to our classes or only allowing certain access to our classes. So possibly whenever we subclass a class or we start a new instance of a class, only allowing access to certain methods or certain properties. So we can have private methods and private properties that are only available to us for computations within the class itself. Whenever we create an object in any class, we cannot access, for example, the method. An example being, say, we have a going to the car analogy. We have a car class, right? And then we have a method for drive. So we have the car start driving. In the background, however, we might have something, if it's an automatic car, a type of automatic, we might have a method for switching transmission. If the car is automatic, we don't want to expose the transmission switch to the public, right? So that's a private class, a private method. We're not getting to that just yet. It's not. We don't need it just yet. Just an FYI, it's coming later.
So is that when Java some things are public and some things are private?
In what?
In Java and other languages.
Yeah, exactly. So the private stuff is essentially just things that are helper methods within the class itself, and then the public stuff are things exposed API. Can someone talk to me about abstraction? Like, what's the point of abstraction?
Is abstraction where you basically say, is that like basically building an interface? We say these are the methods and properties that you need to have for your class?
No, those are interfaces. They're called protocols in Swift, and we'll get to that next week, actually. And I'll start covering some of the theory behind that. But as of Swift 2, this year's WWDC, Apple actually introduced kind of a new programming paradigm. It's kind of always been around in Java interfaces, kind of setting the rules. But they have a lot more superpowers in Swift, and they introduced this new concept of protocol-based development, which is essentially like interface-based development, where we essentially structs are your main data types, and we'll go over those properties soon. But essentially, the way you inherit things and pass things around is through those interfaces. So what about abstraction? What are kind of best practices about abstractions, and what do we need to know about abstraction? It's more of a best practice than anything. Right. Don't repeat yourself, right? So whenever we want to build a new car, if we have multiple cars that have the same defaults, we might want to, for example, create a subclass that set those defaults, right? So abstraction allows us to reuse code and by making our programs, our classes, our objects just abstract enough for us to be able to reuse them. Right? And that's essentially the whole point behind classes, is to build these blueprints which are abstract, yet let us change certain properties. Can someone talk to me about inheritance?
It's where values are passed down to views that reference a parent class.
So yeah, that's mostly correct. So it's a starting point. So basically, we have a parent class. We have what's the parent class is one level up exactly, right? What's the overall superclass, right? So we have a superclass, and we have subclasses that inherit properties from a superclass. So when we inherit properties from a superclass, or when we subclass from a superclass, what happens exactly?
All the properties and methods remain the same unless you change them unless the program otherwise.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So when we inherit from a superclass, we get those exact properties and methods that are available from a superclass in a subclass.
Should you separate for each class should have its own Swift file?
Mhm.
Like even if it's a subclass, should it be its own?
It should be its own file. Yep.
One file?
Yep. Good question. Yeah. So I want us to get in practice of whenever we build a new class, regardless of whether it's a superclass or a subclass, it should be its own file. And how does a naming convention work?
What did you say?
How does naming convention work for these classes and files? Capital. Yep. So classes should always be capitalized. And so will structs, which is what we're going to today. Structs should always be capitalized as well. And the file name, what should it be? Yeah, it should be exactly the class name. That's Swift. So the file, when you go into the group, create a new file, right? Remember how to import, create a new Swift file. That file name should be exactly the same as your class name. What about polymorphism? We only talk about this really in theory, but this will be coming in much more detail next week. But it's important for us to understand, even though we're not really going to be applying it even today or even next class, but the following class will be using it more. Can someone remind me what polymorphism is?
Only example I can think of is when you're applying a variety of type to whatever the type is you're allowing to be multiple, whether no string or whatever. I think I'm sure that's not the correct definition.
Yeah, I mean you have the right concepts. Yeah.
It's when you have a subclass and you want it to take the properties and methods from not the parent class but something else above the tree. Right?
Yeah. So basically, it's setting one class type, and then being able to switch that type to another type that's within the same tree. So basically, if we have a type of car, we can have the type of car be equal to a type of Honda. Essentially, polymorphism is. So it's kind of setting a wide net and then getting more specific if we need to, switching our class types.
Would that be like a duck-billed platypus or something, where you're like setting some part of the animal to ducks and some part to mammal? Like, is that?
Sort of. So it's kind of, yeah. So you have, if duck is inherited from mammal and setting your new instance to, for example, a mammal, then you can later set that instance to a duck.
Yeah, I think you're right. Chicken.
Yeah.
You have like duck, but then you don't.
You can't like take like you can't.
Yeah, unless you take it. It's gonna be on the same line. If you define a mammal, you further define it as a duck. But it branches. You can't take the
So it's two different, how is it different than inheritance?
I think it's similar to later, when you work it later. So,
Car, let's set this to the type. Car, right? So now I know that T-car is type of car. So now I can also say if I want to reset it to, if I want to make it equal something else, it's T-car equals the Honda. And it will let me do that, even though it's a different type, but it's a different type within the same chain. So polymorphism is being able to access another type within the same tree.
So it works up and down the branch when this going up.
So yeah, it works. Yeah, there's a couple of instances which we'll go over which will have problems, but it will usually work out.
cross breaks with it.
Huh?
Like I couldn't take T-car equals what it's like.
Nope. Nope. Yeah, it has to be within this, exactly the same hierarchy. Let's go actually even a lesson back. I want us to get really comfortable with optionals. Why do we use optionals? And give me an example of how we use optionals last class.
You have to define what the variable was. Like, you don't want to just, you can't force them to decide yet. There might be a decision that needs to happen, or they have to find something new as well.
Yep, that's exactly right. So an optional lets us pretty much prematurely define a variable that we can reference later, and we'll have an idea of what the variable is, right? So we have to set the type, and we set the optional. So we set the expectations, but we haven't yet set that variable. So in last class's example, when we started working with Interface Builder, how did that work? How do we set that?
Question mark?
So with question mark, but what was the example that we used?
Input? The button input?
Yeah, so the objects from Interface Builder, right? We wanted to reference them in our controller, right? So we dragged them to the top, right? We did the IB action or IB outlet to the top of the class, right? The top of the controller. And we set those before the view loaded, so those were optionals by default. We'll start doing a lot more. This will be like a everyday thing now. What about arrays? How do we define arrays?
Name and square brackets.
Name and square brackets. Yep. How do we create an empty array? Empty brackets. How do we access a certain item in an array?
Bracket, index, bracket.
Yep. So bracket and the index of the item. Where does the index start? For 0. Very good. Very nice. All right. So let's jump to structs. This is the last new theory we'll learn for the week, and then we'll start doing a lot more breaking down the problems and a lot more putting things into practice to solidify everything we've gone over. So we've worked with classes so far, and classes had one main difference from structs, which we covered last time. So when we created a class, and I try to duplicate the class, I create a new variable and reference that class, what happens?
Pointers point to the same place.
Yeah, they point to the same place, right? So with classes, here we go. So I had a variable that said bar, let's say, base car is a car, right? And then I said variable that's car is the same as Teddy's car. So then both of these things form a new car, and now they're both pointing to this, right? So classes that don't let us duplicate items by default, they only reference things. They reference to objects. They create a new instance, and then we reference that instance, right? So when working with, these are great for when we build like architectures, like view architectures, when we work on building like structures. But when we're working with actual data, this gets very dangerous because we can't really duplicate. We can, but it gets really tricky. And then inheritance, although very powerful when it comes to the very dry data, can also be quite confusing. So a lot of times inheritance actually ends up making things much more convoluted when working with simple data structures. So this is really where structs come in. Structs are value types. So instead of creating a reference to that object, every time we set it to that same variable, we create a duplicate. There's a few key differentiators here, and we'll do a quick experimentation with structs. First of all, remember initializers or constructors in classes. We had for users to set those properties, those values, collect those properties from the user, public APIs. We had to create the initializers and pass as parameters the initializers, right? By default, structs do that. They require us whenever we define values at the top of our struct. The structs have something that's called kind of member-wise initialization, which basically, if we have a struct with a variable of x and a variable of y, instead of doing init and then doing x integer, y integer, again, structs do it by default. So they expect us to set those variables from the very beginning. Now, we can set initializers. They allow for initializers, but by default, all of our variables in our structs get initialized. So if you want to set defaults for structs, we set them at the very top, right? So if we have variable x, we can set it to 0, variable y set to 0. Then we're not required to enter those. But if our variables don't have those defaults set, structs will require the users to enter those defaults when they get initialized. Just some nomenclature. Classes by default, whenever we initialize a class, it's called object. When we work with classes, it's called struct. It's called instance. And the reason for that is it goes back to kind of value and reference types, right? Classes, it's an object, and everything is a reference to that object. With struct, every new struct is a new instance of whatever you're working with. Whether it's a copy, whether it's a brand new one, it's always a new instance. Just some other background info. This might get too computer sciencey, and we can get in more detail once we get a better understanding how kind of the stack of iOS works. Classes by default, there's something called the heap and the stack. Does anybody know what that is? So it's just two different processes for where our applications run. The heap is much more memory intensive, and it's essentially where most of our kind of dynamic computations happen. So the life cycle of our application is managed in the heap, and it can hold indefinite amount of memory until our application crashes. When working with things that get that are within the heap, we're responsible for initializing them and deinitializing them, so kind of managing the memory. The stack is much more like temporary values. So in the stack, it's linear, and it's much more. I think of it much more as an array, and you push things to the top, and after you hit the stack's maximum size, things at the bottom get pushed up. So things that aren't used anymore get pushed out. So the stack is exponentially faster, like to a factor of 10. So structs, the computation for structs happens on the stack. The computation for classes, memory for classes happens on the heap. There's a bunch of implications with both of those scenarios. I don't want to go over them today, but just know that the stack is much faster and it's a lot less dangerous to manage. You don't have to worry about managing it.
So does that mean that struts are more prevalent in iOS code?
So when it comes to building our models for data, yes, you should build your models for data in structs. If you're building kind of application architecture, like if you're building a kind of view class, or if you're building kind of a something that you inherit from, the properties that you must share across the application, then the class makes sense. Apple, for anything data intensive, is recommending we go with structs. Even though that's not been the case the past few years, as of this year, they're recommending we go with structs. Now, another key difference is structs do not have inheritance. So structs are single level.
So you can have a substructure. It's always structure and instance, structure and instance.
Yep. However, we can have interfaces with structs. So I don't want to go over too much detail for interfaces today, but we can have rules for structs, which is not quite inheritance, but it kind of works in the same way as inheritance, in that we set those standards. But however, we have to define those standards by hand every time. So when it comes to dry data in our application, dry models, structs are the way to go because A, they're easier to work with, and B, they're a lot less dangerous, and C, they're a lot less memory intensive. And if you have data that you were gonna replicate in any form, it's a lot easier to work with as well. What happens a lot of times with classes, if you have functionality that requires you to replicate your classes, you might replicate your class or reference to a class. You might be done using it, but what often happens is one of those references ends up not being moved away, so you can have memory overload because your classes, even though you might be done using it, it still stays in the heap, and the heap keeps growing.
Does anything in our programs delete the heap at any point, or do we always have to?
Yeah, I mean, so Swift has got a garbage collection, and it's fairly smart, but it's not perfect. So if you have any kind of reference, this is a danger for having multiple references. You might think that you might have deinitialized an object, but because something else might be referencing it, you haven't. It's still got a reference for it. Or what's even more dangerous is you might have two references to an object, and you remove the object, and you might think you removed the reference as well, and then you have an empty reference to an empty object, which causes crashing. So when it comes to building like hierarchy and kind of big architecture for our applications, classes make sense. But when it comes to working with data, structures make a lot more sense.
Wait, can you say that last part again?
Yeah. So classes are great for when you're kind of sharing properties within kind of views, for example, right? So you might have a view that inherits properties from another view. That's why our view controllers are classes, right? Because we inherit from UI view controller, right? We inherit properties from a library that iOS gives us, that Cocoa Touch gives us. So that's kind of structure of our application, right? That's kind of architecture as a blueprint for how our application works. We're getting certain superpowers from our classes. Whereas structures, they're much more data-driven. So when you're storing information, that's when you want to do it in structs. Now, they can be interchanged. It's just a best practice. Yep.
Are there like pre-made structs like there are pre-made classes?
There are. Yeah. Well, come across a bunch of them. Now, most of CocoaTouch and most of iOS architecture is very extensible, and it's meant to be to be really reused over and over again and extended. And because of that extension mechanism, the classes are used a bit more in our architecture. But it's because what iOS gives us, what CocoaTouch gives us, is architecture. They don't give us data. That's why we'll run into more classes. But when we're working with inheriting data or using data, that's when we'll be using some structs, and there are quite a few. So structs look very, very similar to classes when we create a new one. Instead of a class variable, we use a struct. However, we don't have to set defaults here, nor do we have to initialize, right? So just by having this, when we create a new instance of a struct, we by default get the initializers with all those variables. If we wanted to not ask the user to set any of these, we would just do var y float equals 0. And I wouldn't ask for y. Questions on this? So I'm going to do a quick example. No need to follow along with this. All right, here we go. I want to build a struct of, go with the rectangle, their example. And I'll go x float, y float. I'll say square as a new rectangle. And we'll see, we'll see that we get those requirements by default, right? With classes, we would have had to do the initializer with x and so on. So I'll say 20, 20. So I can do another square is same as square. So if I do another square x and I set it to 30, there should really be width and height, but it's okay.
Do we put optionals in structs?
We can. We can. Yeah.
If there was an optional, we don't have to put it in the initialization of like square.
Yep. Now if I do square.x, we see that those values are different, unlike with structs, or classes rather. Does that make sense? Now if I had a struct of shape, and I did this, yell at us because we can't inherit from a struct.
Put x, like just x above like that var square.
If you do what?
Just put like x above var square equals rectangle x where you didn't initialize it, like when x come back in the middle at that point. Like
Sorry.
right above that line 12.
Line 12 and
Just at what x?
x.
Will it come back in the middle because it's initialized?
Well, x is part of our struct, so it has no context of what x is outside of the struct. It only has context of x if we initialize a new struct.
You have to do rectangle.x.
Think about doing something like this. Is that?
Well, I guess outside, but like when it initializes, like because you kind of initialize it if you var square rectangle.
Yeah.
If I did it, what is it initialized to? Is basically my point.
And-
Like outside of the struct. Does that make sense, that question? No.
No.
So like, if I have a struct here, it initializes X and Y automatically.
Yeah.
Do they initialize to nil, or do they initialize, like, what do they initialize to?
It's got initialized to something. Going back, so let's try this. So we have to do something. We can't do nil. It'll yell at us unless we do that. Right. So it's expecting a value unless you set it to an optional.
You can't do rectangle dot because it's not a variable, not in that.
Yeah, so rectangle is expecting us, we can't reference this rectangle because it's expecting us to create a new instance of it, right? We can't access just a blueprint. One more thing to mention here is constants in classes. We didn't spend too much time on this. If I have a class of car, I'm gonna do let doors, it's an int, and I do init doors int, right? You guys remember this? Then how do I set doors? So the self.doors equals doors, right? So now if I do tcar equals car doors, I'll set that to 4. So if I do tcar dot doors equals 5, even though we set the yeah, actually it yelled at us. I don't know why. So it used to be so classes were mutable, even though we had constants in here. It used to be so we could have changed the number of doors. I guess it changed it to 2.0. So that example is no longer relevant. Structs are much more immutable than classes. I guess they're making classes more immutable too. Really, the main differences are structs are value types. We can duplicate them. They have default initializers, right? We don't have to set the initializers. And they don't have inheritance. Questions on these? So when do we use structs over classes?
When you're not building architecture and you want something that's gonna be able to handle a lot of data quickly.
Yeah. So data, when we have data types, essentially.
What's a practical example? Would an account, somebody's account logging into your app that you handle in struct?
Anything where you store data. So if you have, for example, the class example, the class exercise was supposed to do less class. The default file I gave you was a class player. But player, because player has data, it should be a struct. We'll now do a code along, but I want to make sure that we understand the basic differences here.
So you're just using the car as an example, but it should have been.
Yeah, so one of the properties of classes was that even though we set constants, they will be mutable. So even though you said let doors equals whatever, you later it allowed you to change them. Right now it didn't let me do that. So I guess as of Swift 2.0, classes are immutable if you set them to constants. If you set the properties to constants.
But should that class have been a struct, and you're just trying to show us how that worked?
Yeah, yeah. So Swift. So as of this year, really Apple recommends us if you want to share any kind of properties between structs, we do that using protocols, and we'll start doing protocols next week. And it's really instead of inheriting, protocols just give us the rules for those types. So I'd like to do an example together before you guys start working individually. And I want us to do as much practice as possible, but I want us to first start breaking down these problems and do a refresher from last class too. So I think there's value in us creating a quick app together and breaking down these problems collectively. So before we start coding, I think it's important to also kind of get in the habit of breaking down problems and writing down business rules. Especially if you don't have programming experience, it's super important to do this. But I mentioned a few classes ago that I've been programming for over 20 years, and I still do this with every new program I start. I lay out the business rules and then build out the models and the data types. So let's build a quick app, which is kind of a random fact generator. So what I want to do with this is I want to have a number of random facts. Have a set of facts. And I want to make it so whenever the user selects, taps on the button, we generate a new fact. I also want to, let's make this a bit more fun. We have a label, we have a button. When the button gets clicked, label changes and background also changes of the whole program. So if we have a pool of facts, how do we store those? Array. Perfect. So if I was to break this down, I would have my storyboard, my view controller. What else would I have?
IB action.
IB action. We have our outlets, which connects our label and our button. How would I store? Where would I understand it's an array, but where would I store my facts?
A database.
In a database or a model, right? So how do we store values and models? The struct, right? So this will be a struct. I will call this facts. I also want to make this a bit more abstract. So we can certainly do this straight from the view controller, and the view controller will interface with it. But I want to also couple the functionality for this color generation, this color wheel, into its own thing. Because the way we're going to approach this, I'd like to have a pool of colors that we randomly pick from, just like our facts. So going with that, I'd like to build a color wheel. And we'll make this a struct as well. So the approach I like to take is, in my facts struct, my facts model, I like to have an array of facts. And in my color wheel struct, I'd like to have an array of colors we can interface with. And then there will be a few methods in each of these. Like maybe there'll be a method here for randomly generating our colors, right? Taking a color from our array.
Does the kind of like, if I click it, does it say that the fact is repeats itself in the same color?
No, let's make it random. I mean, we can do that if we want, but I'd rather just have everything random all the time, at least for now. get to work. Let's create a new project. This will be a single page app, and we'll call this fact generator.
Do you think the bottom of the text unchecked?
I'm sorry?
The unit test and the UI test?
What was it? I didn't. No test, yeah.
For some reason they're checked.
We'll go over it another time what those mean.
Do they hurt if they are right now?
No, they don't. Basically, what tests do, they rewrite rules for our programs. For example, if we have a button that generates random color, we set the expectation for what it should do. So if someone goes in our code and changes the functionality, and instead of having our program break, our test tells us, hey, the expectation is no longer met. So in our storyboard, let's also make this just a normal iPhone view so we don't have to worry about sizing. And so our rules are, we need what? We need 2 components.
We need a button and a label.
Yep. So a button. And we'll say this is generate fact. And your label. And I'll just make this a bit larger here. And let's make our button a bit prettier here. Let's see. Let's give it a set width and height for now. So there's a bit more padding around it. And let's also center our fact up here. So far, so good. So let's also go ahead and set up our models, right? Our models are our data structures or data set, right? So to create a new Swift file, again, go in the group, go new file, and I'll just make a Swift file, generic Swift file. And I'll call this the fact book.
What's the Cocoa Touch class again?
A Cocoa Touch class is like a predefined class. If we want to inherit from like a view controller, UI view controller, that's where we do a Cocoa Touch. So if we create a new controller in our app, we do a Cocoa Touch.
Okay.
So if we want to tap into the iOS ecosystem, already existing classes, that's what it's for. Okay, so let's create our struct of fact book. And let's also create a new file for our color wheel. And same thing here, struct color wheel.
So we can delete everything else?
What do you mean? You create a new Swift file, right? Not a new Cocoa file. So again, in the context of model view controller, our views are what we have in interface builder so far. Our controller is our view controller here, which has our view with our logic, right? And then our models is where our data sits, right? Now, throughout the progression of class, our models are the ones that are going to get a lot more beefy. And as we start building more complex applications, the number of models, number of controllers grows really, really large. So it's important to get in the practice of grouping our models and controllers together and our putting structure behind our programs. So let's go ahead and start doing this now. Even though we don't have much here, let's create a new group for controllers and a new group for models. Yep.
Sorry, so the file over there is a new,
So new file,
new file.
click on source, and then Swift file.
Yep. And then token. Okay. Idols, right?
So let's create a group for models, and let's create a group for controllers. Oh. In the homework assignment, you'll see that the controllers that ask for all the functionality are in a controllers group. So the fact book and the color wheel should go in the models view, and the view controller should go in the controllers view, or controllers folder rather, or group is a proper nomenclature.
Should it make a storyboard?
It can just stay there, yeah.
Do we need to do anything in the IDE to refresh the directory?
No, so directories are there just for our reference. As far as Xcode is concerned, the hierarchy is totally flat. So the reference will always be the same. So everyone should have this, right? We have our controllers group with our view controller in there, and our models group with our structs in there, right? So let's get started with some basics. Let's tie up our button just so we know that our button works and we can get a connection. So how do we do that? When have you guys walk me through this?
Welcome to the assistant editor,
Yep, assistant editor.
and then you control drag from the button to the top of above the override function of viewed load.
Yep. So
I guess you can put it on the bottom.
yeah, it can go either way. It doesn't really matter. So IB outlets, references, I usually put at the top, and IB actions I usually put at the bottom. So we'll select action instead of outlet. And does everyone remember the difference between the two?
Outlet is for properties, action is for events.
Exactly. So action is more like a function. So for grouping functionality together on a tap or on a gesture. And a property is for changing like the text or changing the color or changing the size.
But it's not on like a user.
It's not what?
It's like, so by outlet, like I'm not gonna press the button and change the color or text.
No, exactly. However, when we click the button, we have to reference that label, so we have to have an outlet for the label. So we'll call this generate fact, or just generate fact action. There we go. Yep.
Would you, just coming back for a second to the folders, would you create another folder for classes?
No. So well, it depends on what your classes do, right? Depends on how you structure your application. If your classes are just for data, they're models, right? Models are where your data sits. So if you had a class, if you had a model that was structured as a class, then I'd drag in models. I would do it much more by functionality than by type. So just to make sure this works, let's just do something very simple, and let's reference our label and just change the label text when the user clicks the button. So can you guys walk me through that?
Control drag to an outlet from the label to the top of the class.
Yep.
And make it an outlet and name it whatever.
Yep, so it's spec label. And then when I tap the button, how do I change the label?
Fact label dot text.
Yep, so now what's best practice? Do I do just fact label?
Self dot fact label.
Self dot fact label, right? Because it's still a class and we're referencing a property in a class. Self dot fact label dot text equals button worked.
Can you just spell out what each of those points of the self are connecting to again?
Where? Right here?
Yeah, so fact label has to do with that up there, and then self has to do with.
So because this is a class,
Yeah.
and remember in class properties, to reference the class property, best practice was to do self.class property. So our label, fact label, is a class property, right? So to reference this, we do self.fact label. Right? So this is a class, therefore to access the property in class, we prefix it with self.
So we made fact label a property of view controller by dragging it.
Yep.
I see. And then dot text is just saying that we want to access text as part of the view controller.
Yes. Yep. Now remember, because everything is same as me doing var my label equals UI label, right? But I don't have to do that because I did an outlet, and that makes that assumption for us. So let's just do a quick review here. If I want to change my fact label programmatically without clicking anything, how would I do that? Where would I do that?
Viewed load.
In viewed load. Why viewed load and not before that?
Because you want to wait for it to be loaded before you do anything. Otherwise, you'll be changing something that doesn't exist.
Exactly right. Yep. Yep. If we change the properties of fact label before we did load, our view, our label will not yet have been drawn on the screen. Therefore, we'll get an error. So if we want to change the properties of any of our objects in our interface builder, we have to do that through viewed load. So I can do self.fact label, and then this is the first thing the user sees, right? So I'll say fact label.text equals you have not yet generated a random fact, right?
What happens if you change the label within the storyboard?
You can do that. I want us to get in the habit and get used to doing it through programmatically.
So that would be the same as what we're doing. It's like default text.
Exactly.
Okay.
All right. Questions so far? So let's start by first creating our fact book, right? So our fact book needs to have an array of facts, right? So can you guys walk me through that? Well, this facts array. Yeah. And I'm doing these, you can have them in new lines just because each fact is going to be pretty long. So it's more difficult to read. So when you have an array of a whole bunch of, for example, long strings, or even dictionaries, we'll go over dictionaries next week. It's easier to read this way, right? It's all about making it easier for the programmer to understand. So give me some facts.
People are mammals.
The sky is blue.
Are mammals. Sky is blue. I have some facts here as well. Ants stretch when they wake up in the morning. Fact. What
It's
else?
always darkest before it's completely black.
Wait, it's always what?
Darkest before it's completely black.
You guys drop some knowledge on me.
One day the sun will explode.
When what? One day the sun will explode.
One day it will. And when that day comes, we'll all be dead. Sorry to be.
E equals MC squared.
E equals MC squared. A few more. I got one. On average, it takes 66 days to form a new habit. The state of Florida is bigger than England. Huh? Yeah, right. I cannot live there.
Fastest animal is the cheetah.
And it has to be learning something.
Do what?
Yeah, birds are faster than cheetahs.
Birds are faster than cheetahs. Okay, that's good enough. Huh? Nice. Tupac is alive. Nice. Okay. So let's start just by testing this before we start doing the random generation functionality. So if I want to create a new instance of my fact book, how would I go about that? And where would I go? Where would I do that? Where?
Right below the.
Yeah, either before or after. So I'll just go facts, and then I'll call it my facts book.
It doesn't need to be loaded for you to declare your variables. Will it create all the refer your variables before it loads?
Yeah, so it's fine to load this because we're not yet setting it, right? And we don't want to do it here because what happens if we do that here? Yeah, we can't access it from the outside if we do the read alone. So if we create a new instance of the fact book in the top of our class, that fact book instance is available to us throughout our whole class, right? Throughout our whole view. So now we have access to our fact book in all our methods here. So then I can change the text to self.myFactBook, and we'll just pick a random one, number 3. Oh, why didn't it work? No, because we have initialized it, but looking at the fact book, how do we?
We need a getter method.
Nope.
Oh, we need to reference facts array.
Yeah, facts array. So factbook.factsArray. Right, because the fact book was accessing the whole instance, right? We have to access the array within the fact book, and the array is just a property. All right, and there we go. So we are now able to pull the fact from our fact book. However, it's not random.
Let's go random question. For the label, you have to set the width.
You don't, no. We are right now, just because I don't want us to worry about that. So I just drag it from one corner to the other. Yeah. But labels are one of those things that the size of it depends on the content. So you should usually not set a label width in most instances. So if I wanted to generate a random fact, where would I do that? Where would I put the functionality?
The down there instead of in where the 3 is, it should say like rand or something, right?
Yeah, so we can do that. Again, that will work as well. However, we want to bunch our functionalities together, right? So what if I want to be able to create a new program and really just be able to drop my factbook Swift file in a new program and generate a random fact from my new program, right? I would have to write that function again. Or if I want to, create another view and generate another random fact, I would have to do that in the controller, right? So you were saying?
So you do it in the fact book.
You do it in the fact book. So then from over here, we can just do, we can just reference that method. So in my fact book, oops, didn't do that.
So it's like you do everything related to the fact book in the fact book.
Exactly. Yeah. So how's this going to work? Let's talk to this. So I have an instance of the fact book in my controller, right? And if I have a random generate function, what's going to happen?
It's scrambling the order of the array.
It's gonna either that or select a random one, right? And then what?
Should it return just the
Exactly. Yeah. It should return the fact. Yeah, exactly. So what type is it returning? It's a string, right? Again, this is why it's important to decouple our functionality from our view logic, right? Because if we just did a print, it wouldn't print it in our label. So we need to do two things here. We need to figure out the size of our array and then select a random number between 0 and the size of our array, right? So we'll do, this should be a constant, array count. And we'll do facts array dot count. So we have the size of our array. Then we want to select a random number, right? So we'll do random number. And there's really a bunch of ways to go about this. We've worked with a random. The one I'm using is arc4random. Arc4random uniform. Uh-oh.
Yeah, they took that out and switched
They
to
did.
2.0.
Uh-oh.
So at this point, how do you view the documentation for add random, buff, and stir?
So you should be able to just click into it.
So I mean, but yeah, so we go here and now we don't really have any information.
Or you could do
I know I could Google
option and question mark. It's
Just
not
add
giving
one of
us.
them and then do options.
Yeah, so this doesn't have any documentation either. So yeah, Google is the best way if this documentation doesn't give you anything. Although when I did this, arc4random uniform did work. Yeah, it's still working, just not auto completing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so let's stick to that for now. It's the one I've always used. So with arc4random, we're basically with the uniform, we say it starts at 0 and it counts up to a certain number. So this will be array count. So it's expecting a type of uint32 for the array count for this thing in here, right? So how would I go about making this, setting this to a uint32, which is what it's expecting?
UN32, open parentheses.
Yep, uint32. This is how you usually typecast in Swift. You do the type and then the parentheses around the type.
What is it, the kind of type?
Why is it the kind of type?
No, what is it? What is UN32? Is it a 32-bit integer?
Yeah, it's a 32-bit integer, essentially. It's an unsigned integer, essentially, which gives you a certain range of what the integer could go up to.
Okay.
All right.
Why is it that instead of like
Why is it instead of just an integer? Is there a guess or?
no, I guess it's just the first time I've seen that done that way where you're like it's okay.
Which part of it? I mean, let's
Where
talk through
you're,
it.
like defining the thing in the parentheses by the thing in front of it.
Right here? Yeah, because this arc4random method, it's expecting a uint32,
Right.
and our array count was an integer. So because it's expecting uint32, we have to set this. We have to transform this in uint32.
Sure.
Right? So the type of this becomes a uint32. So then we have our random number, right? So how do we then select our random item from our array with that random number? How do I access my array?
do self dot fax array, and then open.
Yep.
and then your-
And then we can just return this, right?
I'm trying to find the documentation for the random function and like all these functions in the Apple developer thing. I can't find it, so I mean like, I don't know what rand is gonna return. Is that gonna return an integer? Is it gonna return, if it's gonna return an integer, like what's the maximum value, what's the minimum value?
Yeah. I mean, we have to Google it. I'm not sure what the maximum meant. I think by default, rand is between 0 and I think it's in the thousands. I don't remember what thousands. But yeah, we have, for some of these methods, documentation just isn't available, unfortunately, because they're kind of their own global methods. So Stack Overflow, Google is the best way to go about that. So we're getting an error here. So we cannot access an array item with a uint32, right? Usually we do a 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what type is that? Integer, right? So what do we do then?
Typecast again into an integer.
Yep, exactly. So typecast again. Does this make sense? This could be all done in one line, right? We could fit all these down here, but it's not very legible. And again, there's always a give and take, right? You want to be more explicit, so when you come back to it, it's easy to read. So we're first we're getting the array count, then we're generating a number between 0 and the count, right? And then we're returning that number from the array, the index from the array. So now, in our view controller, instead of doing fact book the facts array, what do I do?
My fact book link with the method.
Yep. The random fact. So now every time I hit the button, we should get a random fact. Questions so far?
I'm getting a breakpoint back in my MacBook model. The return of the.
Yeah, I'm getting that too.
The breakpoint?
Yeah.
You have parentheses and braces. Oh, this happens to me all the time. I don't understand why.
It's harder to figure out things. You know what I mean? It's just like what can be, one other thing like next color. So for
So breakpoints. You have to clear the breakpoints. It's weighted. It's in the debugger.
Did I send myself?
No. I used to have to go all the time.
Okay, so you named just something else at first. and then your controller, you change the name, so it lost its reference. Right? So
It's like, it's.
so when you drag and drop something, you cannot change the name without removing the reference. So
That's how.
here, access nodes.
So irritating. Show 6.
Oh, to go to do a kind of 6.
Oh, we. So.
Yeah, I think we're next.
Yeah.
Dragging down this more time.
7, 8.
No, do kind of 6. Yeah. So yeah. Click there.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No.
So usually when you get an error, it's starts at the top.
Oh, wow. And places that shouldn't be in.
Yes, this happens to me sometimes, like it would just inject a breakpoint, which is a way for you to like stop the computation that you're trying to like step through. Because otherwise it runs too fast, you just don't know.
Okay.
But I don't know why it injects breakpoints sometimes. Maybe there's like something I'm clicking on or something that I'm injecting by accident.
Okay. What's a button here to inject the breakpoint?
What's up?
What's a button here to inject?
Right, I don't know. It could always happen.
Deactivate breakpoints.
So run it again.
I didn't change the problems if you drag them in any of the outlets.
Thank you. Imagine having this problem and you by yourself.
Oh, that was me. That was me. It took me out for a week.
So what did you do?
So
Like just a label.
what'll happen is it'll come up with something that says red breakpoint, and then we can use Command 6, which will take you to in this pane. It'll take you to that little what looks like a little sign, and then you just have to clear the breakpoint or take off the breakpoint that's on there. So that's the one. Just want to check that like it's right at the beginning.
Okay. Oh, okay. Gosh. You do want to know.
No, we want it like that.
These are always will pause the functions. Okay. It's the same thing as the JavaScript debugger in Chrome. Familiar with that?
What do we put in the background?
Okay. Yeah, so this is supposed to be a.
Oh, I see.
It's not really parsing with it. So those connections, whenever you drag and drop, they're always available through here. So you can remove it.
I was jumping.
Yeah, if you guys, while I'm debugging, if you can, try and give a shot to the color wheel and how that would work.
Okay.
It would be very similar to the fact generator, except for instead of strings in your array, you would use UI color.
What color is the class?
So you actually
Find
create,
out, right?
you actually list all the colors you want
Yeah.
randomly? Okay.
It's really weird. Well, it's-
So do we create a class in color wheel? Or
Uh,
do we start with the struct?
we already have the color with structure, so that's where you do that.
Right. So I just Googled it.
Yeah, let's get into
So it's not your controller.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's what.
Huh? Yeah, no, it's everything's right.
Get to import UI then.
Is that what it is?
And color wheel.
Yeah.
dress the color.
Nice. That's like struggling on that for a while. Gotcha.
Can you just say that, or do you actually have to do something?
Important.
Yeah.
You just say that top.
You just say.
Import UI to the top. Right below like import foundation. I think.
Yeah, that's where I am. So it goes UI color and devices.
Yeah.
Yeah, at this point, I'm not sure what's going on. Everything looks.
That should work.
Yeah, I do have those square brackets. I did those square brackets. Well, that sounds like step one.
Does anybody know what the alpha and the color?
Alpha's transparency.
I still have problems with the importing. Importing the UI color.
Sorry?
Oh, something.
Oh, no, the UI, you have to import UI kit first. UI color, I think it's a struct.
So the
It's
UI
already treated
color is
as
a property of UI kit.
Okay, it's already imported. I mean, it's already the structure of the UI color.
No, it's still a
Exactly.
rectangle button
That's
to
capital I, capital K.
the only name for it. Right.
Yeah, you don't have to import
So maybe it was something a little different. But there was
So think of
still
it- think of like-
reference over here to it.
Leather suits is a feature of.
Yeah. That would have been possible area. If you hear that, it was not helpful at all.
What was it?
It was like an empty reference to something, but the error was just like, it was totally.
Errors are so unhelpful.
Well, sometimes they're very helpful, but sometimes you just gotta look for the wheel yourself. Anybody have any luck with a color wheel? Yeah?
On the tutorial.
Yeah.
No tutorials. Okay, so why don't you guys walk me through this then?
You import the UI kit.
import UI kit.
Yeah.
Nice.
You create an array.
Yep.
inside your constructor,
So we'll call this colors array.
colors array, fine. You wanna make each element an instance of the UI color.
Yep.
Subclass.
UI color. And then we'll go with these.
And you type random numbers in there.
Yeah, so we'll go with 90. I have a whole bunch left defined here. 90, 107 out of 255. And then 181 out of 255. Alpha is 1.
Mine I just did red color.
Do what? So you can do just that red color.
Okay.
How does that work? Or if you, the 97 to 55, you dot red.
I just got rid of all of
So you could do UI color dot red color like that.
these.
Okay, because when I was doing has the same thing, but they left the other color 0 and the alpha transparent for 1. It's only show the red, but you don't have to do those.
Actually,
Yeah, so UI color lets us reference colors in different ways. It has predefined color names, so red color, blue color, transparent color, we have black color, etc., etc. Or we can do RGBA, right? Values of red, green, blue, and alpha. These are all available in red colors as well. We can also do hexadecimal if need be. And this one is yelling at me. Red, green, blue. I think it's because it's expecting double. What are my values as? Let's see. It's because I have a comma still in the array. All right, so we have teal. And I'll do what you did. Yellow color, UI color, dot blue color, UI color, dot green color. Huh?
It's a lot easier.
Yeah. But you also don't have as much control, right? These are pretty fine colors, so you can't set the shade or the hue or anything for these. Let's see, what else are we missing? Black color. Got go with purple color. Orange. I think we have yellow. I think it's good enough. So we have our colors array. So then our random color generator, what would that look like?
Make a function for random color.
Yep.
And output a
UI color, exactly. And then the actual logic for this will be very, very similar to our effect book, right? So color wheel. We'll go to color array. Right. Does everyone have this? Does it make sense? So we have an array of UI colors, right? And then we have a method that returns a random color from the array, just like our effect book of strings.
So I got to this. It's a sub. I'm just trying to think of the class hierarchy here. So I'm outputting a UI color.
Yep.
But in reality, like there's subclass of like dot orange color. So like when I return it back to the actual function, like I guess when we get to the next part, I'll have my question.
So you're saying like what's being returned here, is that?
So yeah, what the return is a UI color
Because this returns UI color, right? This is an array of UI colors.
of UI. Yeah. It's this with the orange color, so the subclass of UI color is UI color.
So it's not a subclass of UI color, this is actually a method of UI color, right? Remember, when it has class dot name, there's usually the property, and if it has the parentheses, it's a method. Yep. So then if you go to the view controller, when do you want to switch the colors for this thing?
How did you just do that?
If you want to navigate around as our projects get larger, we have quick navigate with autocomplete for names like fuzzy matching. If you do Command-Shift-O, you can start typing the file name. So view controller, VI, highlights view controller, and just press enter.
I'm sorry, what happened? I missed everything.
So you can switch between files, right? You can switch between files very quickly without the mouse, but doing Shift-Command-O, and it autocompletes, fuzzy matches the name. So I can get to the main storyboard just by doing M and enter. Shift-Command-O, start typing view, goes to the view.
That was a big thing for you to flush out.
That's, yeah. Can't, man.
There's tons of productivity, but one step at a time.
Xcode would be amazing if it didn't crash.
It would be. It would be. All right. So we now want to access our main color, right? Or our color wheel, right? So how do I go about that? Yep. My color wheel. Right. Then what? How do I change? With the button title color?
Underneath your last action, your action statement. Where you
Yep.
change the text.
Yep.
Change the text label color also.
Yep. Actually, let's start with actually changing the view color, so the background for our overall view, right?
Background color, self.view background color.
Yep. So to access the view, the overall view in the view controller, we do self.view.background color. And then
Is equal to my self dot my color wheel dot
brand color, right? So let's change the background for our view, but let's also change the color of the text for our background, or for our button. So how do I do that? How do I access the button?
You have to make the button output, don't you?
Exactly, yeah. So right now, we only have access to our button action. We don't have access to our button outlet, our button properties, right? So what we want to do is we want to drag our button outlet into our class. So we'll say G button. Right, as an outlet. And then we'll go to view controller. And then we'll reference our button. And we'll set the background color. So this is set title color. And we're going to select the second item here. So we set the color, and we want to. So buttons have different states. They have a normal state. They have a state when it's being pressed, and they have a state of after it's pressed, when it's being let go, right? So let's first just change the state before we come back to the color. So we'll do UI control state dot normal. Now we haven't started working with this type over here. This is enum type. Enums essentially are kind of like used as optional values, option values. So if we have a set of options, like for example, button states, we store those in enums. We'll go over those next week. They're very simple. They're just a way for us to store these options. So if I click on my UI control state, I can see all the states for my button, right? Now, how do I set my button color to be the same as my background color every time I randomly generate something?
You reference the background being something being a background color.
We could do that. Or another way of going about it is we could just generate we do random color and just do this. I think this is a bit easier to read. And then reference that in both cases. Right. So we create a constant just within the context of our action, right? And every time we collect the action, that constant gets reset to a random color. And then we can reference the random color for both the background and color. Run this. One thing I also want us to note is we just wrote a butt ton of code without testing it. This is pretty bad practice. I just want us to talk through the problem before we, kept going back and forth. We usually want to write, a function or a few lines and keep testing it all the time. It makes it a lot easier to debug. If we go this route and type, 20, 30, 40 lines of code, it's a lot more difficult to debug if you get errors. So it's working, but our button's disappearing, right?
It's the same color as the background.
Same color as the background, yeah. So let's do this. Let's go in our storyboard and just set the background color of the button to white, so only text changes. So we have a text color. Background by default is none, so we'll set the background to, I'll set it to white. You guys can set it to whatever you like. We can also do this with code, right, in our Vue load.
Everything you do in Vue control, like if I set presets using the way you just did it, will it be in code? See what will automatically translate to code, or it just kind of exists?
It just kind of exists. Well, in code, you can actually reference the, the property. So you can just do the background color and it'll return that. Yeah, exactly. Questions, comments? Does this make sense? Does it make sense when we organized our color wheel and our fact book in a different file, right? So now if I wanted to, we can export those files to a different application and reference the same functionality, right?
So there's those.
So it's not just useful because things are grouped together and more abstract. We can reuse them in different programs.
Say you created a new controller. Will you have to import the classes you created?
Nope.
Take out.
No. So whenever we create a class in our project, a class or a struct, we don't have to import it. So everything that we have here is accessible throughout our programs.
Okay.
We just need to instantiate a new instance of that class or struct.
It's like a playground. You can test out playgrounds classes. Good kids.
Now you can, as of 2.0. So 2.0 we can reference structs and classes.
Okay. Is that an update recently?
Huh?
When was that? That was up.
As of 7.0.
Can you show me something real quick? Go back and I did not remember. I can't remember which one.
So what's happening? What did
I
you
just need to get the phone back over here so I can.
No, so if you do, it's two ways. You can either do this is an editor, or Command Option Enter.
All right, thank you.
To the color wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
What was the form state for the subtitle color?
What was the what?
Uh,
This right here?
UI control state.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
So we can either do UI control state than normal, but we don't need this first prefix. We can actually just do dot normal if we know what those options are.
I have a weird problem when I'm trying to generate two different random colors.
Let's-
So, all right, I commented on. Where is this? Okay, so what I did first of all, my color wheel was blue. I just have red, green, blue, and then I'm generating
Referencing back those colors.
floats.
I don't know.
And I'm trying to.
It's an English struct. It's not right.
Okay, I
now-
see.
Now in here, I do the color tuples equals so that colors like that green color. Okay, then here I want to get a new color tuple. Okay, so here's a bar.
So the
So
function
I
has
want
to
to
be
get the green color, and then do a new color whatever. Then I want to change the text of the back label.
Okay, so it's gonna get that better.
Okay, so you're looking at it, it's working, but like before it didn't.
Was it?
It was giving me a weird error. It was giving me a weird. I don't want to get it back because that's ridiculous.
So while you're doing that, guys, let's work on the class assignment. Under the lesson 6, I have the in-class assignment. Let's get started in that. I'll be walking around and make sure that we're all up to speed so we can keep moving forward next class. It's important to keep practicing this and getting in the habit of breaking this down into more abstract problems, right? So now the requirements from last class should be easier to manage, right? Last class, the requirement was to build it in the class. In the folder 6, lesson 6 folder, I have it as a struct because the player should be a struct, right? It's a player with values and properties. And whenever we compare players, we're comparing values. Therefore, there should be structs, right? And not references. So if you load the lesson 6, it should be the in-class problem. And the requirements should be in the view controller. So if you load this up, we should have all the to-dos here. And I encourage everybody to try the bonuses.
Yeah, could you go back to the view control? Sorry.
Did you replicate it?
Replicate what?
Problem?
No, so I don't know, it was really, I mean, I think the only way for you to undo it to the previous state was before I added the ID out to the G button. But you can't just control Z button, right?
Yeah.
Well, you can from
Because I still have flags, so I'm not sure what I do.
Things the same way he did.
How do I know?
So,
open this up.
no.
No, yeah.
So that random one that's should be plugged in, right?
Yeah, it kept saying that I needed that's what the error was like, to do multiple commands on the same line, insert a semicolon, which I thought was weird because I didn't have multiple lines.
So, this one?
Okay, so. I tried building a tune again. Okay, so here, I did this. There we go. There's the error.
Reference. It has to all be in this code.
Oh, wait a minute. I see what the problem is. There's for some reason two lines, I don't know what that came from. That's what it was. All right, so I'm just going to, whatever, just going to redo everything anyways, because I eventually got it.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, I'm doing everything. By the way, if I didn't want to do the command drag or control drags, whatever, I could actually literally just write @IV outlet weak var, and then over here, now that I haven't done that, I can do like
So we could select it from here. Yeah, this is the way. There's a bunch of ways. There's also I don't want to go through all those now, but you can first define the view controller and reference them from here. Should be
Let's go one start.
referencing outlets. So if you drag and drop the referencing outlets from here to your controller over here, drag it off the circle there.
do referencing outlet.
Here.
That's now. I get that one. Okay, cool. Yeah, I probably should have. Okay, cool.
Guys, feel free to take a break and definitely team up for this. I would really prefer if you guys try to tackle the bonuses. So
What is this for? Just for doing what?
this is lesson 6 in class. So this right here,
The assessment folder,
it's in the lesson 6 in class folder.
the class one.
Yep.
Just my favorite.
So I did so much. There's one thing, obviously,
Make sure you. I'll go on your Yeah. Lessons.
Yeah. Oh, this is my button.
So, so when you left the photo, you did it on the phone, and you went into, did you drag, I know, drag, I might take one thing.
Back here. This is back here.
They did on the, I think I tried, but.
We still need the button as an outlet.
Okay, but it should be down at the bottom.
So the bottom is action, click it.
Right,
But this is to reference change color.
okay, yes, so I did that, I dragged it over there.
Yep.
Okay, but I didn't need to drag it down. I say that.
So let's start with there. So we're going to call it as a variable. We already did the function. Alright, then the-
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's what I just said. Oh, maybe that's right. No, that's right. It has to be an outlet.
Oh, you're missing them.
Yeah, I did it, problem because it was something fun.
Such a, yeah, so maybe it's something.
Here,
Yeah, because that would make sense if there would be a button.
oh yeah, you got that coming right here.
Oh, this is.
You drag it in.
Maybe I should just-
Yeah, that's a problem. That's usually the time you have dragging.
So it's trash. Oh, it is in breakpoint. At some point when we have an error, then when you have errors, it usually puts a breakpoint wherever the error is. So if it's dark blue, you're gonna have to just check it. Otherwise, it just stops right there.
Okay.
It's yeah. So it's exactly. So it's for debugging. There's another one here. Now make sure that in your storyboard you change the background color of the button so it doesn't blend into the background. So scroll down. No, that's the text color. And scroll down. There it is. Whatever. So we get what you need.
Okay. Before we go on this, I just wanted to get, I got this freaking.
Okay.
How much of this have you done?
thing is,
Yes, this is it.
right,
Yeah, I didn't take
So this is
what I originally.
so it's for senior changes. Could be that we get enough varieties from the bottom. Crack it out.
That's what another thing I think I should get from this question. What is not coming up as I have the one and the project we don't see it.
Okay. Yes.
I don't understand what we're doing here. Yeah, so we're just doing this for one. So this guy, this is great. Player class, right? These are good player file, right? And then I just think I don't because we have 4 text fields. Okay, and then we have a button. Yeah, it's for some reason player one, player 1, player 2.
Oh, right.
So it's like.
I mean, you might have to.
For age, you want to. So you kind of pre-establish player 1 and player 2. So it's 4 communities. Okay, so I've got, okay, so I put in the name and the properties, so basically I'll be entering. Yeah, okay, and then the button is the acting matches the player 1 size where it is on so basically, we decide who's the winner based off of player. It's like the rules, like whatever that one is great. I whatever players. So like it should distribute out. They're all 3 of them are ends are flipped. So we already have players in the race. I just like all of them. Okay, cool. Got it.
So this is not the file your project worked on?
Okay, this is the record.
Okay.
So it is saved in there. I have to have all
Okay, good.
No, I was freaking out. Because I wasn't getting the lesson 6.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't popping up.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Cool. All right, good.
Alright. So, just in case though, if I have an issue with the GitHub again, could I just copy the file from the online GitHub and put it back into my folder?
You can, yeah. Yes. You shouldn't have to. It doesn't happen, just like call me or ping me. But if I'm not like there for any reason, yeah, you can do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Both of yours.
Yeah, I was just having.
Same goes for Eric.
I was just having some issue with that get for the.
I tried to do this one just to be all.
Right.
Is the same says that itself is
Inside the property. One by one side.
So.
And outside of this structure, you can make comparison.
Where is it? Oh, so for that, is because you have to, the
I don't know what it's gonna be.
Access, or limits.
At least with the time, that's how.
so
I mean, I didn't.
by default,
I don't know, we gotta go.
the button color is immutable, just because buttons in Cocoa Touch are a couple of views combined. So this is one of the only things that, only properties that you have to do through a method. So for the button color, you just do set color for the state.
Okay.
So for here, you do random color, you do state, you do dots. Should fix it. And then also one thing to make sure it does is these are breakpoints. Okay. So whenever you have a shader, sometimes Xcode will highlight the default. But if you do this highlight, regardless of whether or not you have shaders, your code will stop moving somehow. Wait, what? So you either did it manually or Xcode did it for you.
Well, you have to
So you if it's a breakpoint, it's highlighted, dark blue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just clicked over here because it doesn't want error. It's all the error ones.
So that one.
It's the name of somewhere.
No, there's a fault error. Oh, there was also good.
Really help. So likely.
Maybe this function is
Oh, the button just means which could be fun.
this how you
So- Color.
Shadow color.
Yeah. What's that?
Yes, oh, that's
What's going on with you? What? Yeah, of course. So. That's what it is. Controller.
Oh.
Good call. Yeah.
It's so it's we just have to focus on this because when we get the text bit, it's easy to it has to be some class text base to user input, user text.
Oh my god, that's the first thing I look for now.
This is right, this whatever interface is here the equal. I just don't know how to
So,
code it there where
yeah, so you have the reference, but you don't have, so now we have this, so there's a trick, we don't always have to redrag it. If you already have this defined, you can actually here,
You know what?
and drag.
You just keep going here.
Then
So there's gonna be something here, that's where their text is.
here, and this tells
Whatever it is.
so we can pretty find
Okay.
So otherwise, so what would you do? Delete it and then redrag it?
Yeah.
You can just delete it from that.
Yeah,
redrag it.
exactly.
Because it doesn't tell you the narrative.
Yeah.
If anything's wrong, it's
Okay,
It's
so
so
this is
small.
it.
It's so small,
Yeah.
yeah.
I didn't even notice that.
It's just been a week out.
Thanks. So we gotta figure out a way to know what I mean? What it is.
What was your random?
And then make that, whatever that
Yeah.
is.
Underscore random, underscore uniform was the first.
Oh, arc for yeah. It's not complete anymore. I wonder if it's being deprecated. I didn't see any notes on that. So arc for random uniform. It's funny, they're not even exposing it in the, if you click in here, they're not even exposing it in the public API. So the arc4 random uniform, when you click into it and you go to the source file, they're not even making it available here. It's really weird. That's why it's not auto-completing.
I think I was thinking. You think that this is the right approach?
Oh, I just want to open it up. Wait.
This is here. Store data and clear. Oh, that's right. That's the first thing.
How we doing? Okay, I think, I just have, so there's a couple things I didn't do.
Oh, yeah.
Alright, let's see, geez. Okay,
Okay, so let's go to the next.
So, one, a couple things, so I didn't, alright, so I wasn't really clear on the things. First of all, in the storyboard, I have, this is gonna be the player one name, player two name, it's the property, one, two, and I'll just, put the results in there. Okay, so player, I just have name, age, and gender.
Yep.
Now, in view controller, after I do it, first of all, I think I need to do some things. Okay.
Just find this somewhere else.
One, I didn't know if am I supposed to randomly select the age, weight, gender, or height as to what property that's supposed to go to, because it's not defined as a specific
Yeah.
property.
No, it should just be one of them. And the bonus says, then you should figure out a way to pick a winner based on all the three properties.
So I have to add similar for each player, I have to have four text boxes for each player. Okay. So I would have 10 total text boxes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So,
Cool, so that's fine, so I know, so I've done that then. Okay, so wait, first the number to do.
Well, we never used self backwards. If we want, so our variable take the value from that thing. That's what I don't know how to do. So I'm gonna do it, you're right, going. Yourself.
and then,
The other side.
if you're abstracting more, build a game class, and then pass the players the game class, and do this logic in the game class.
Wait, say, do this logic, do this in the,
Do the match, like figure out who wins the game.
okay, so here, so then I would do. Bunk, the interim winner.
Nope, I would do it because this
Why did I do
is,
that?
so each player gets a new instance of player, right? So you have two instances. So I would create a class for game.
In the same file?
In any
okay,
file,
then-
yep. And then I would have player one, player two, and pass the player one, player two objects to the game class and figure out the logic from there.
Okay, that's fine. So before I go here though, I should do something like if, self dot v1 name dot the text is equal to nil. Now I want to do, or I guess I should just do not nil. So basically I should test to make sure that they're all not nil.
So
And that the other one
Oh,
should
it's,
be an
I
integer.
don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, so by default, actually, because when you create the text field with the view, it will no longer be null because it exists. So the value for that will just be empty. So it will just be.
Okay, so then what I need to do is double check that
Create
it's
a
not.
We're gonna do it's not nil and it's not empty.
As long as it's not empty, and then I have to check. So for this particular case, because there's only one text, I don't need to bring it. Because of gender, I would have it to be like string, but everything else, like age, weight, and height would have to be integers. So I would need to make sure that, I'd have to test that the text field for the property isn't
Oh,
Yeah.
so,
not equal to nothing.
Yeah.
So that part I didn't do. So, okay, so then basically,
Well, so yeah, you have to first of all
The players are.
check it's not empty.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But everything is in the text field regardless of whether it's a number or anything off the ground, it will still be a string.
What's this?
Whatever it is.
and if, so let's say I wanted to see if it was an integer. I would do something like if self dot view one crop dot
Yeah.
text, and by the way, the two int isn't a thing anymore. I would have to do
Into
int,
exactly.
and then,
Does not equal null there then. So make sure, I would double check that. I think if you typecast it to int and it's not an int, it should return null, but I'll double check that.
okay.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanna do this.
Yeah. Or if you wanna quickly look up the syntax for an alert window,
Yeah.
it's super simple, just a couple of lines.
There's,
So just search Swift alert box. Scroll down. There we go. Yeah, close it. You can just have one button there, you don't have to have one buttons. Pretty good fancy.
okay, all right, cool. For now, I'm not gonna put that in there because I don't know. All right, what is this? Okay, so now I have to do, I guess I always have to put it, I always have to bang it to make sure. So like if I don't, I get that error.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
maybe you should do it. So you put it above. Okay. Does it have, do we just choose the category?
Okay.
No, so one of the main, another one.
There's one. Or did you check on that?
Just where are we?
On,
So we can just do this.
that right,
Okay.
but your other three variables that are not named for options. Which is.
Gotcha.
We didn't make them up there.
Because it's like double click or something?
No.
Okay, so I will run that down here so that we can find it. Before you embed in our structure.
Oh, I could have just pushed this to clear the,
Yeah. So,
And it takes us to clear name screen, so. No, no. There's space of one, just keeps the name.
You said they're both the same. So. The older age range or something?
I have no idea. Okay.
That's correct.
All right, so your bonus, you use the background and have all the game options. Select winner based on multiple properties. Okay.
and that's where you get creative, set a certain amount of points to each property, and you know, you can figure out a weighing mechanism for each property.
Create a function here.
Wait,
So each property can have its own weighting mechanism, so you can have certain properties have more weighting than others, right? So you can have, like, a Bugenta has more points than the other one.
That's good.
Yeah.
I'm just getting started, so going,
The layout looks good.
going okay, but I'm just getting started.
If you're working on all, we can do it right with 2 billion. I'm trying to do it with the last person.
Yeah.
Yeah, that looks good. That's right.
So how do we make the method inside of the structure?
How do you what?
How do we make the method inside of this deployer structure? There always does say it takes an input from somewhere,
Takes an input from,
what do you call it? From whatever, from anything. So we wanted to take the method from the bottom, but I want to take the method inside of the deployer structure. How do I assign that input to that specific struct that then the inputs of the struct that I think we.
oh, so when you, so let me see your controller. So basically, you collect the information from the text fields, and then you essentially get a new struct and pass those documents from the text.
Okay, okay, that means, okay, that we get a break walls doing that. Collecting the wrong information from the text because we Googled it and you said, you called the bottom, I'm sorry, the text field, and then you write the text.
Yeah.
But then, I guess that 2.0 doesn't recognize plain text.
Should,
Should
yeah, but make sure that you, like by default, so when you set the text field, use the text. But when you pull the text field information, by default text field is optional, because everything in that is going to be viewed is optional, so to get the value of the record.
Oh, I didn't know,
Okay.
because I
I have an idea. Thank you.
So, no, we got some stuff in there.
had it. In my class. Probably.
Catching up. Actually did that.
What's your
Your structure.
So what's the problem?
That's just his space.
Oh, that was should be the storyboard. No.
No.
So I think the first thing that you want to do is set the name at the front. Like you want to make the player one. Or you want to make a player one and a player two in the view controller. When you're clicking on the button, right? Okay, so you're actually just setting it up there, not based on. Yeah. So what you
Well,
want to
you
do
need
is
to,
here.
well, you don't need this one here, but you just have to do this stats of the mesh.
Okay.
So you just go from here,
Yeah.
start showing.
Next to the sun, you can zero to, and I guess you have. Yeah. I like the story in there. I do as well, actually. So they're like free.
How you doing?
So like, but then you're gonna change the name later. Well, we changed it.
Okay.
So yeah, so like when you can change
So,
it
yeah.
as and when you can change it.
Okay. Where does copies come from?
Where the property.
You can,
So.
but always put them in an array as opposed to having them as their own property.
So here, this is, okay, you have, okay, so this is name, and this is the property. Okay, so you'll work like you're just entering the name here and the name here, and then you'll enter where the property and the property and you just play.
But
You wanna
why
play
would
so
we
you
use array?
change the name.
So that means I'm never back up age, Michael, age B26.
Right.
It is a default,
So, like,
right? That's what you're gonna do, or?
Okay, I'm ready. So yeah, if I make it so it's like.
You don't want one.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so I.
So the other approach
You change it later.
I'll just
So first of all, let me show you
This
something,
struct.
just to help you out.
And that way you can create, and then if you want to say defaults,
Placeholder
you
text,
define them.
let's just say it's always going to be equals, you know, and here.
But if there's an age is refer for each player, then it can't
So
be
we
referred.
younger or player.
So then when you in your controller or like create a instance for that, to say var data equals player, right? You
Now
can
you
say
know,
right there.
now
Is
it's
that
actually
right?
just kind of easy for you to see. Plus
That way Rebecca will always be 23, not
will be in there.
26.
So, what I
What
was
was
doing was
you're
here,
saying we can do that here.
we.
You can, but what would you want to do if the age is under
It's
third
one
for
of
each
the
player?
simulation of it, so,
Because it's part of the file,
player one,
right? You said everything related to the player, player file.
True, in terms of structure, but then each player has a property referred for each player. So then when you do this, for example,
Well, you can do it, I mean, you're just defaulting it, basically, what you're doing right now. So you're just gonna be, player one name,
You can do that.
equals,
player,
and then the same thing for self dot player two dot name is equal to self dot player name. So text. And so on and so forth. And so you would do it also for the property. So you would say, self dot player. Well, here you have, it's actually player one, and then you do dot age. Because, self dot player one is referring to this, which is an instance of your struct player. And so we're just gonna change, I mean, I'm just saying, age, whatever. And so,
we should have done it.
player one dot from dot text. And then the same thing for player two. But anyways, also, you wanna kind of check, make sure that, that these variables are set. So let's see. So yeah, it's asking an insert check right there. So yeah, you should, but only you should do it like this.
it's not bringing them back.
Self dot. Player two name dot.
Oh, you know why?
text
So even though they're optional,
does
you
not
have to
equal
declare them. So you have to say if it's optional, you can just say, I don't want to set the genders and
Oh, yeah.
in the middle. But you still have to declare all these when you first instantiate the player.
And
Do
then
I need to put it at the top?
that's why
there?
now you
Because
can
it's not
always use
functional,
the
so
thing
do I need to put it up hard?
so you know for sure it's something.
No, it's still this is here. It's good. So
Yeah,
right below the
for
class,
this
yeah. So
one.
the top here is
So that way you can set all.
so the actual meaningful part of the
And
class.
then you'll do your logic. where
It's
you'll-
weird because it's not
Yeah,
short.
player,
Just like
player,
it's-
one or two property, dot age or name or whatever. It's very equal to, and then you set your output text.
Yeah.
It's actually, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, well, okay, now that you've commented that out,
Yeah.
you need to, change this from self dot player. Now you need to make player one, and player two here.
Yeah.
So I'll actually create. It the whole bar. So, okay.
It's supposed to show pluses.
So what I would do in this case, now is I would make two if statements. And one if statement would be if like self dot player two name dot text and self dot player or self dot player one name dot text and self dot player one name dot pop are both not equal to nothing. Then make the variable then make the player two restruct same thing for both.
I got you.
Yeah.
I could probably initialize the top two still, or just do like. For these guys.
Yeah, but this is commented out, so it's not actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I got that error. I just think Mike played back or something like that. Sorry.
That's not the issue. It's the same thing. Yeah. I don't know why it's doing that. Yeah, that's right. It's just that I'm completing for it, so weird. You might just have to restart your system for it to complete.
Okay.
Oh, but that's right.
So I can recreate the variable for all the different players.
Yeah. So then you can have a variable for Becca. So variable. I would call this player 1, player 2, right? Because the names will change. So this is player 1 that has its properties, and these properties you're going to be getting from the user input and text field, right?
I see.
So you really start doing this whenever you hit the button, and you'll get the text from the text field whenever you hit the button, right?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Exactly. So you put in names and then one of the properties, whether it's age or gender, just properties to measure. And then you keep stacking properties and evaluating. Let's start with 1. So you have really, so you have perfect 4 text boxes.
Oh, it works.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Hey, did you guys use struts or classes?
So the player is something that you get values for, right? So that should be, because the player has properties and values that you compare against. Well, what should it be? It should be a struct. So whenever there's values that you're storing and measuring, it should always be a struct. Now, if it's like something that's just rules and kind of architecture, then it's a class. So the game would be a class, and the player should be a struct. Right? Technically, you can go either way. It's both flexible. It's just best practice that whenever you have something that stores values, that should always be a struct. Because it's much faster, and it doesn't trip you up if you have to use the compare or compare.
So
But then where?
Sure. So you don't need to show up. So we're going to share
So this is right.
Yeah.
Player struct.
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
What are you guys on?
Some storyboard.
We did that. We didn't just we actually put the text in though.
So where do
Okay.
you
We're here.
So first thing you want to do is you want to be able to
do you mind if I?
access all of these properties.
Okay, this is your.
So let's tie all this up to
And we did tie it as an action.
Yeah, so
It's at the bottom.
Okay, so. Okay,
So we're dragging all of
no,
these.
I don't know what these are. Where did this, where did
We added those, because it's kind of like where the, I don't know, that's what the text.
Yeah, right, because you're not doing action.
Oh, you're on a different visual
Yeah.
Okay, you okay. I feel like this, you did load is, well, never mind. I think you're supposed to have something inside the function also.
So this is the, I don't think this is the real thing. This is the real thing.
Well, where was I before?
That's something else.
So, okay, so what you want to do is first you want to be able to tie the text so you can do this.
It's an action. The actions go under the.
No, it's an outlet.
Oh, it's an outlet.
Yeah, an outlet is like basically.
So then, when do you start
You want to
preparing
connect the
things?
data from.
Well, actually,
to
one more
record
thing.
code, so you leave it like.
Also, make sure that all of your things are aligned correctly. Or name and want to say, or let's say, you know,
Player, whatever it is.
Okay.
And you create you create like 4 outlets, one for each of the labels. By control dragging, so like.
So,
you can
you also need to be able to change the status, right? So you can also finish
do
the
call
status.
and generate view on page.
No, at the top as well, because it's a reference, right? It's the outlets, but
And then for this is the
oh, the
bottom.
bottom of that.
So
Yeah,
the bottom
it
is
isn't
going
there.
to be
That would have
an action.
I made it an outlet, that's wrong, right?
Yeah, you want it to be an action.
No,
So
game
I'll
first.
show you how to fix that.
No,
Okay, so let's do P2 name.
No, because if you change it here, you have to do the action. Okay, so then you have all this connected. So now
So fix
you
that.
want to, based
You click on
on,
here.
Yeah,
Okay,
what's
so
over
you
here?
need,
you want to create a new
Yeah.
player
An
object.
outlet.
yeah, and here, we're gonna just click this action. This is
So how
like-
to create an
Remove
instance
the
of
outlet.
Okay.
player model.
Okay,
Okay, great.
back in the view controller, where you put the.
So the player is.
Yes, that guy.
So just remove that.
Yeah, so I need to create an instance of this chart.
Okay,
Okay,
so.
start over and do the game file.
No, because the player file is the blueprint for that, right?
It is, but I just messed it up, I had to delete it.
So,
Yeah. So now I can do this.
so, they go.
Okay, so,
So whenever you click the button is where you're gonna create the new object.
yeah, so we can do it.
Exactly.
You can make up just like button request or something.
So what is this ID action player name?
Oh, something you got it.
And that's it. So then what is ID action player button, the button?
You need to, yeah, you need to contact that. Also, the same way you connected the other, the way you got it had action. So you control drag it in to the same place, and you, it should be an outlet,
We don't want
and then you
extraneous
name it whatever.
actions. So,
Okay. And what you're gonna do is in that, in the action function, is you're gonna change the text of that to be.
so ID action player one
So
name.
the first thing you need to do now, though, is inside your action, is you need to take all the data in those 4 text fields. You need to store it inside your player struct. So you have 2 players. So, what you should do is, inside the, every time you click on the button, you'll be making 2 new, players. Okay, player 1 and player 2. So, so in the action, do like var player 1 is equal to like player. Oh, yeah, okay, and then the parentheses, and it's not auto-completing for you, but it's fine.
Yeah, you have to clear this up.
Okay, yeah, fine. No, don't change anything.
Okay, so over here, you create an instance of the player, of your player object, right? So, how do you create the instance of the player model?
So yeah, you're gonna do
player.
I don't know why, because it wasn't working.
It's weird because it worked.
Player.
It worked on
So you have two
the
players, right?
second before I tried.
Swinging names first.
So just player one, right? So player one object has all these properties, name. So then how do you create an instance of this struct? So what if player one equals?
It's in this. I started it. Wait. That's how you start it.
Yeah.
So. Everyone equals player.
So what's the name of this struct?
So we're just doing that right now temporarily. Now we do that on player two.
Player dot name.
So creating new instance of the
Now we have it on.
struct, right?
Yeah.
So how have we done
this
this
is
all
what
over?
we're That's
We're
why.
gonna be done an instance of that.
Okay, so we're gonna change the value of these
To be the inputs for me, right?
right. So the first thing we want to do.
So we're gonna do a struct layer is class layer. So create an instance and do
Guys, how to text this, how to use text with so you would do how to check if there's like something like the text field. So you do. No, you want to do
So-
a statement.
the name of the struct is player. So the example of the struct. So player.
Although you want to break self.
So when you're creating your instance of the fact, where's the syntax for that?
But
Where-
is that what you call it, Myers?
My fact.
Yeah. So yeah, you do self dot, you want self dot.
So with that,
So first just check, okay, first one's gonna be a double equals and not a single equal.
how do you set that?
And instead of nil, you want it to be a double quotation mark.
So
We got it.
over here,
It's a string.
how is it instance of my fact? How is
So
my
Okay,
fact?
so you're, alright, so there's two different ways, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can check to see if they're equal to nothing,
So let's try.
or you can check if they're not equal to nothing.
Right.
So
Now, if you check and you see if they're all equal to nothing.
Yep.
You're gonna need to choose one
and then in
thing,
there,
But
you have to pass.
versus something else.
so this way, if it's not equal to nothing,
Then you can just enter your code.
So
Otherwise, yeah, that way it's better to do, see if it's not equal to nothing. So make sure that means there's a value inside the text field, then you execute the code. Otherwise, you won't really be doing anything at all.
And then
So you don't have to worry about, otherwise it's adds an extra step in your process.
That's better, okay.
Yeah, so where,
So
what
you
you
want
want
to
view is a common code.
that,
I see.
because the text field, even if you leave it blank, it'll be equal to nil,
Yeah.
but it's still a value.
Yeah, okay.
So you're checking that and see, but you want to check.
When you
all.
press it, so it gets
Oh, and it's
updated,
not,
but you only
it's not,
feed it to the
self
object.
text. Oh, self.c1.name.text, because they're,
Okay, so that's
so you
the
do that
whole
for
object. How do you reference this?
P1 name, P1 age, P2 name, P2 age.
Like, isn't it supposed to be equal pay or?
But, no, you did, you just did it, now you just need to.
No, I think it might still be.
Now you don't have the error because you didn't have the,
Oh, this has to go in there.
yeah, we'll just do, we'll move that later.
Okay.
What you should do though is on the same line, check all of these, so you had to like do many things on the same.
So whenever this is struct,
So the-
so the default initializes elements, right?
Yeah,
not in order.
So then we pass all those properties.
So it's
You wanna make sure that, P1 name and P2 name.
Yeah,
P1
unless,
names and P2
so
names
unless
Are all,
you're using them for
okay,
now.
but it's the,
So what are the other
Double,
ones?
right?
So then.
So if you ever just, so you would just pass in, you should be able to.
You know, with intent.
That's
So,
yeah. Okay,
So you
so
have your name.
what we're gonna do is I'm gonna open the system editor. I did that by doing.
So just-
Option enter. and then we're in the view controller, and, okay, so you have a C button labeled, alright, first I'm gonna
Now, by default, what's
go, alright, that's the C button.
and instruct is expecting
Okay.
the manager. So you have to type
Alright,
test that.
so this is the only one you have to find. So we want that to be,
So that's your.
you
that's
want
your
the,
default.
to be able to get the value of all these text types. So we control class, drag, and just make an outlet called,
Yes.
like, name ones. Okay, and then we can do same thing for this.
So do the same thing for layer two.
Okay, and now when we want to access that,
Yeah, it's fine.
alright, we have this as an action.
Oh, so one more note
Do
before.
the action, like, it's
By
You want
default,
the action to be
all
on the button.
views in your
Yeah.
scene
That's all.
are options because
Wait, what is
they're not
this?
set right away. They're only set when the view loads.
Referencing
So when you set them, you can
You
do
can do
whatever
that.
you think the text is something.
Wait,
However, because
I
they're
don't know what
optional,
that
you can
means.
use
You don't
the
have to ask me
values.
what that means.
But you don't have to.
This is C button.
So when you pass it
And
in,
that's also C button?
Yeah, you can delete that.
I don't wanna.
No, I mean, I didn't do anything.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, like, I was
let's
thinking.
just, alright, I'll just, alright, here's your button anyways.
oh, because it
This is, alright, you have this, function.
So the same thing for player two,
Oh, okay, so that's.
and then the next step is to compare
Okay, so here,
whose age is
we'll
higher,
do,
and then figure out the worst based on that.
let's make this is your, game.
Look, there, I was gonna have to show what the output is.
All right, guys. Homework is on assessments, and then week 3, homework 3. Do we have any questions before we break? Let's do a quick review. What's the difference between instruction and class?
Structure for data.
Yeah, for values,
Values.
right? In terms of technically,
There's no inheritance.
there's no inheritance structs. What else?
You don't have to do the initial, initialize.
You don't have to. You can, but you don't have to because I remember the term for that.
Initialization.
Yeah, but the struct, the way they got initialized was a certain keyword. Member-wise, initializing is what it's called, where it automatically initializes all of our properties. Right? So why do we want to use classes over structs?
You want to have the inheritance.
We want to have things that have inheritance, right? So when does it usually happen? Does it happen usually with just dry data? With what? Architecture, right? When we're setting, like, for example, the iOS library is probably a good example of that because we're inheriting from lots of other views, right? So classes in that scenario makes sense. Cool. How are we feeling in the assignment?
It makes it helpful to have like a version, like screens.
Yeah, and working out.
Like, just it's hard to follow.
Oh, working original. How to do it? Give me the answer though. Okay, I'll pull it in the video.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great.
It's like, that was kind of making like next layer.
Yeah, I'll post that.
I don't know.
Right, exactly.